So, the quiz was due. I see that most of you have completed it. I think it's still technically possible to do the quiz. So if you check on Blackboard, it should be still available to do. You can still do it. You will have late marks removed, but it's 5% per day off of an assignment that's worth 2% of your final mark. So this is not disastrous in any case. So if you haven't done it, you should go ahead and do it soon. Right? Did it go okay for everyone? Did anybody have, other than question 16, which was malformed, did anybody have technical problems with the quiz? I'm still learning this quiz thing, so I wouldn't be surprised if there were continuing technical problems. But please do keep an eye on that. Yeah?
There were a few questions that were kind of weird.
Kind of weird?
One of them was a question about Fahrenheit, and then asked the same question in Celsius.
Yeah.
And it's basically the same question with a different measure, like a different unit.
Right.
But they yield different answers.
Yes, that's correct. That's correct. Because of an issue that we talked about in class. So water boils at 100 Celsius by definition, because that's how they define the Celsius scale, right? Water does not boil at whatever it boils at in Fahrenheit.
That's the same Celsius.
But they didn't define it. They did not define Fahrenheit in terms of where water boils. That's not how they define the term. So if you dig into the meaning of the term Celsius, water boiling is right there in the meaning of it. Whereas Fahrenheit, although they can be converted, is not in the meaning of the term. Does that make sense? I won't be as tricky as that on the test, I hope. Okay. Ask me about, if there's any further ones that where you're like, you got the right answer, but you weren't sure why that was the right answer, I would be very happy to talk to you about them. Yeah, another one?
Do you have them?
I don't have them in front of me, unfortunately.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Perhaps we can go over it.
The triangle one.
The-
That kind of messed me up.
Does anybody remember what the triangle question was?
It was like a triangle has three sides.
A triangle has three sides. This object has three sides. Therefore, this object is a triangle.
Right. So a triangle has an object that has three sides. This object has three sides. Therefore, this object is a triangle. Is that valid, invalid, sound, or unsound? Yeah.
It's invalid?
It's invalid.
Because you said triangle is anything with three sides.
No, that's specifically what I did not. No, yeah. So.
Oh, right. But you had the conclusion. You didn't have the premise. Like you said it. You couldn't make the backward inference.
So this is an example. This one was an example of what's called affirming the consequent. So affirming the consequent looks like this. If P then Q, where P and Q are some sentences or propositions, Q, therefore P. Right, so if it's raining outside, then the sidewalks will be wet. The sidewalks are wet, therefore it's raining outside. Now that's an invalid inference because there are other ways for the sidewalks to be wet. Right? So just because the consequent is true does not mean that the antecedent is true. We'll talk about these parts more specifically next week, consequent, antecedent, and all that stuff. But so in this case, if something has three sides, then it's a triangle. No, if something's a triangle, then it has three sides. If something is a triangle, then it has three sides. It has three sides, therefore it's a triangle. So for example, this chalkboard has three sides. And in addition, it has a fourth side. Right? So it has three sides. How can you check? By counting up, 1, 2, 3. Also, it has a fourth side, so it's not a triangle. So something that has three sides and more sides, something like that. So there's an implicit, if a thing has only three sides, then it's a triangle. But even then, like, if you go like this, that thing's not a triangle, but it's got three sides. It doesn't have three straight angles, but it does have three sides. Yeah? Okay. In general, this is the thing that you're going to have to worry about. Don't do this. This is called affirming the consequent, and it's like the classic invalid argument. Okay. Yeah?
Isn't 212 degrees Fahrenheit by definition 100 degrees Celsius?
It is not included in the definition of that Fahrenheit. Fahrenheit was defined before Celsius was, so it was defined independently of anything that we know about Celsius as a historical fact. It is equivalent to but the definitions aren't the same.
So that was like a difference between definition and equivalence.
That's right. There's a difference between definition and equivalence. Yes, that's right. So the definition picks out the same thing. Like, yeah. We'll leave it at that. Okay. All right. So, if you've got any more questions, I'm very happy to talk about the quiz in more detail by email, after class, anytime. Right. So this week we're going to do clarifying meaning. And there isn't really all that much to learn this week, exactly. Like there's not a whole lot of content. The main concepts that we're going to talk about are things like the principle of charity. We'll talk about vagueness and ambiguity. Briefly talk about generics and universals, and start talking about conditionals. And we'll do much more about the formal side of conditionals next week. Or sorry, not next week, on Wednesday. But the main thing that we're going to do this week is argument mapping level 3. So we're going to continue with the argument mapping process. We're going to continue with this gradual ramping up of the complexity of the arguments that we're going to deal with. And I propose to start with that stuff. So let's get started on argument mapping. And we're going to just map a couple of arguments. We're not using any new skills here. It's just all of the stuff that you saw before, but now combined. So we're doing complex arguments rather than the simple arguments. So the first time we did argument mapping, I was just asking you to identify which part's the conclusion and which part's the premises, right? The second time, I asked you to identify conclusion, premises, and whether the premises were dependent or independent, right? Now we're going to do combinations of dependent and independent premises leading to a conclusion. So we're just going to deal with more and more complicated argument structures. It's not that complicated, just one more step in this process. Okay? So these are complex argument diagram. This is a complex argument diagram. And you can see it's just all of the same things that you saw before, like dependent reasons for the conclusion, independent reasons for the conclusion, but also including premises that lead to other premises that lead to the conclusion, right? So we're just taking the elements that you've seen before and putting them together in like slightly more complex ways. All right? So hopefully this is not conceptually difficult. It might be practically difficult because the space of possibilities that you're facing is much larger than before, right? Before there was only really just two possibilities, like dependent or independent, or that's the premise and that's the conclusion. So there's really just like a binary answer to all of the questions that we've asked so far. Whereas with these complex argument diagrams, there's probably lots of possible ones, and you have to search through a larger space to figure out what the actual one is. But hopefully it won't be like too terrible. We'll see. Let's see how this goes. All right, so what I'm going to propose is we're going to do exercises right off the bat today while you're still fresh. So if anybody doesn't have a piece of paper and would like one, I have some blank paper here for you. So, you're going to draw these argument diagrams. What you're going to do, we're going to go through these together. You're going to break these down into premises and conclusions. So bust, if you don't have a pencil and implementive writing, bust one out. And then we're going to diagram them in complex ways. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, are you ready to see what I thought the answer was? Okay, so here's how I had it. All right. So all cats are cute. So this is so the first three is easy. All cats are cute. Dory's a cat. Therefore, Dory is cute. Okay. Those are clearly dependent reasons for believing P3. Right. Any worry about that part of it? Good. That part should be extremely familiar from last time. And then the way I thought it would go from here was that P3, Dory is cute, plus P4, Dory is friendly, would combine with cats who are both cute and friendly are worth keeping. Now, it was pointed out to me that there's at least, so you just knowing that Dory is cute and that Dory is friendly, if that's all you know about the universe, and I'm telling you cats who are both cute and friendly are worth keeping, that's not sufficient to infer C. I got this wrong, actually. So actually what you need is P3, P4, P5, and P2 also here, that Dory is a cat. That's clever. I did not think of that. On a test, I would fully have accepted this as a correct answer. However, I would have also accepted P2 here as well as part of these dependent reasons. Yeah?
So we can reuse premises?
Yes, you can reuse premises. Yeah. Yeah. Did anybody get a different answer than this? A substantially different answer? Like, yeah.
I had two solutions. One was, I guess I didn't have P3, P4, P5 all attached. I had P4, P5, like one premise and then P3 as another.
As,
And my
as,
first,
as independent reasons. Yeah. Yeah.
but then that's not making more sense there.
Good. Good. If it's clear, so long as it's clear why this was preferable. Yeah.
But do you actually have to append P2 to the bottom line because you've already established that Dory is a cat in the first line? It just seems redundant.
So partly it depends on how strict we're being here. So the question here is, do we pretend that we know at each inferential step? So if we were being completely rigorous, like deductive logic rigorous, you have to at each step pretend you know nothing else about the universe except what's being given to you in this line of the inference, basically. Almost none of the inferences you're going to make in your life are like that. Like, you're always bringing background knowledge to bear, and you're also bringing stuff that was established earlier in the argument to bear. So partly the question is, are you thinking like a rigorous calculating machine, or are you thinking like a soft-headed human being who knows things about context? Either is acceptable for this class. If you want to be the perfectly rigorous logical machine, that's perfectly good by us. That's cool. If you want to be a little sort of more less rigorous, as apparently I am, then things established on higher levels are sort of assumed to carry to lower levels. It's not very satisfying. I'm not very satisfied by that answer, but you're kind of nodding approvingly, so I guess that's good enough. Yeah.
Why would you consider P3 and P4 as dependent? Like, could we have P3 totally independently?
Oh, that's correct. So that's very right. So it's not that P3 and P4 have any inferential relation between them. So it's not the case that Dory being cute shows that she's friendly, and that she's friendly does not show that she's cute. These are dependent because of the combination with P5, right? So P5 says cats who are both cute and friendly are worth keeping. So that's what makes them dependent. So these three all have to be true together in order to establish C. So if a cat is cute but really mean, or really nice but ugly, I don't think I've ever met an ugly cat, but suppose there was one. Have you met an ugly cat?
No, I was just gonna say. This conclusion's a bit weak because you don't really prove that you should keep Dory, just that Dory is worth keeping.
Well, that's okay. That's okay. Well, it doesn't necessarily give a specific concrete action that you should take, but it nonetheless is the result of this argument. So that's, I mean, sometimes it's okay to have a relatively weak conclusion. Actually, to have a strong argument, it helps to have a weak conclusion. A weak conclusion is easier to prove than a strong conclusion. If the proof was everybody should keep Dory, that's too strong. Whereas if the argument is, this cat might be worth keeping, then this is perfectly sufficient to prove it. So a weak conclusion is okay. If you're only trying to prove something small, you don't have to bring as much evidence to bear to justify it, right? So, okay. Yeah.
In general, can we have like two or more conclusions that are like independent of each other? Or are we always working our way like to a singular conclusion?
Okay, so are we always going towards a single conclusion, or can there be more than one conclusion? So I'm going to try, in contexts like this where I'm just giving you kind of toy arguments, I'm usually going to have it just going to one conclusion. So assume one conclusion for the sake of these exercises. That is not a safe assumption anywhere else.
Like in reality.
In any more than a couple hundred words long piece of writing, it's very possible to have more than one thing that the piece of writing is aimed at. And in a debate, oh man, conclusions can come and go and be shifted around, and people have multiple conclusions that they're keeping in mind, and it's not always clear what conclusion that they're driving at. And clarifying that is one of the primary skills of sort of getting your argument well-grounded, basically.
But I also mean like a conclusion being like a single statement, but that statement is like separated by like conjunctions, like and. Therefore, we should then allocate our time for this, and we have to do so. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's one sentence, it's a final conclusion.
Oh, I
but
see.
It's like several components to that conclusion.
Oh, that's fine. So, so if you say we should keep Dory, and she's cute,
Yeah.
that would also be justified by this argument, right? So it's a conclusion with a conjunction in it. That's fine, yeah. So long as you prove both sides of the conjunct, yeah. Just like in formal logic, where you can have a conjunction in the thing to be proved. That's fine. But as for like totally, you'll find it sometimes if you try to formalize an argument from like an editorial or from the internet or something like that. You'll find that you can't get it down to just one conclusion. It seems like they're just arguing for two separate things at the same time, and the premises can be all mixed in together, but you can't figure out a way to make it just one conclusion. And that's just how messy natural language is. Okay, want to do another one? Let's do another one. All right. So I'm not going to break this one down into premises just yet. First break it down into premises, then I'll show you how I thought it broke down, and then we'll move on to do the mapping, all right? Okay. Want to move on? You want to see how it's going, or you want to keep working? Okay, I got nobody urgently saying they want to keep working on this. So here's how I had it. P2 and P3, so whenever my upstairs neighbors are home, their lights are on. Right now their lights are off, therefore my upstairs neighbors aren't home, P4. Right, so it's not the precisest puzzle piece, like it doesn't have the easy quality that you might be used to of having like Dory's a cat, all cats are cute, therefore Dory is cute. There's a negation in there. So the negation makes it slightly more complicated, but I hope you can still see the basic idea here. There's nothing terribly complicated about seeing that negation as part of the dependent reasons, right? Okay, you have a question? Yeah.
Are some of these going to have multiple answers, or is it possible?
It is fully possible for there to be multiple answers, especially as we get more and more complicated. Like on the full-length argument analysis last semester, I saw dozens of different diagrams. Of varying quality, admittedly, but like there was often several right answers about how to break these down, or at least several answers that we would accept, because language is complicated and all that stuff. But again, I'll be trying my best to make it clear. Yeah, question?
So, can you tell me why P4 and P1 are together?
Right, so either my upstairs or downstairs neighbors are talking loudly, my upstairs neighbors aren't home. So the inference here is that all right. This is another example of something that we'll talk about on Wednesday. This is what's called, in technical terms, a modus tollendo ponens. So if you say P or Q is true, right? So that's the form of either my upstairs or downstairs neighbors are talking loudly, and you know not P, so you know that P is false. Then you can infer Q. Right? That's the basic form of this. Yeah.
Why is it P1 that leads to the conclusion as opposed to P4?
Oh, sorry. So there's supposed to be. That's not supposed to indicate that the location of the arrow
Yeah.
is really just connecting to this thing. It's not. Yeah, it's definitely not P1 rather than P4. It's definitely supposed to be the combination of P1 and P4. Yeah.
Can P4 be considered a
Yes. So different textbooks differ on how they talk about this stuff. Some textbooks want you to call anything that has an arrow pointing to it a subconclusion. I just personally find that a bit messy because you get a lot of different. I like just having it's all just P until the C, basically. I find that to be a cleaner way of writing it. So you could call this a subconclusion. You could call it a premise. One textbook I saw had a very interesting way of putting this. So they'd say P1, P2, dependent reasons for P4, P5 or whatever. And they would mark these with a square and the conclusion with a circle and something that's both a premise and a subconclusion with a square and a circle, something like that. So this is the P4 there is both something that's you're being given evidence for and something that stands as evidence for something else. Just as a matter of convention, I propose to call anything but the final conclusion a premise. Yeah. Just so that we're all on the same page, we're all talking the same way, and I think it's simpler. Did a question?
Subconclusion also be a super premise?
Okay. Can a subconclusion be a super premise? Not that I know of, but yes, you can use words any way you want, so long as everybody knows what you're talking about. Yeah, question. Yes, so that's very good. Yeah, so in P2 here, you would say, you could rephrase this to, if my upstairs neighbors are home, then their lights are on. So you would rephrase it into the nice conditional form that you're used to. So that would be a nice rephrasing. Yeah?
Wouldn't that fail? Wouldn't that logic fail? If you say, like you said it P, then Q. You can't say Q then P.
Right, so
It's not here, therefore it's modus tollens.
it's modus tollens. So the thing that I warned you about was what's called, it's good that we're doing, all of the stuff that we're going to talk about on Wednesday is coming up today, so we've got this arranged properly. So the thing that I warned you about was this, P arrow Q. So let's let this stand for if P then Q. So the arrow says if P then Q. Q, therefore P. That's what's called affirming the consequent, and that's a logical fallacy. This here should be, if I did it right, what's called modus tollens, which says P then Q, not Q, so call that not Q, therefore not P. Right? And that's not a fallacy. That's a valid argument, because anytime that P is true, this says anytime that P is true, Q must also be true. So if you know that Q is not true, you can infer that P is not true. Yeah?
So P2, P3, anyhow, so the upstairs neighbors, they're not home.
Yeah.
So how could it be P1, either my upstairs or downstairs neighbors are talking loudly if the upstairs neighbors aren't home? Am I really confused?
Well, no, that's the nature. Oh, sorry.
To say they're either upstairs or downstairs neighbors are playing music.
Well, so the inference was from playing music to being home. So whenever my upstairs neighbors are home, their lights are on. Right now their lights are off, but my upstairs neighbors, so my downstairs neighbors must be playing music. So
P4, my upstairs neighbors aren't home.
yeah.
And then P1 is either my upstairs or downstairs neighbors are talking loudly.
Right. So this is the weird truth conditions of a conjunction, a disjunction, which again we'll talk about it on Wednesday. Let's just talk about it now. So if I say the following, if I say P or Q. Now that thing that says or, so P or Q, this is true in any case where either P is true or Q is true, or both P and Q is true. So I am a human, or the moon is made of green cheese. That sentence as a whole is true, because one of the things that composed it is true.
So are they dependent?
So P4 and P1 are dependent reasons for believing the conclusion. So P1 gives you this, and P4 gives you not Q, from which you can infer P. So if this is true, one of these has to be true. One or both of them has to be true. And then if you know one of them is false, the only possibility is that the other one is true. So either I'm a human or the moon is made of green cheese. The moon's not made of green cheese. So that if this first thing is true, then it must be the case that I am human. Yeah? Good. So this is what we're doing right now is called sentential logic. It's the first month or so of like modern symbolic logic. We won't get too deep into this stuff. There's, again, PHL247 is the place to go if you want to really learn the heck out of this stuff. But it's important to get this basic logical stuff in place. Okay. I think we have one more of these, and then possibly I'll give you a break. Is there two more? Oh man, I'm really working you guys. Okay. Once again, map the following. So break it down into premises and conclusion, and I'll show you how I did that in like 1 minute. Okay, so I think that's how it should be broken down. I think there shouldn't be any surprises there for you. Now please go ahead and map that. Here's how I had this one. So P1 and P2, if you apply the puzzle piece test, you can see that there are dependent reasons for P3. So if you touch the electric fence, you're going to get a shock. And if you get a shock, you're going to feel pain. So if you touch the electric fence, you'll feel pain. This is what's called a conditional syllogism. So once again, one of those things that we're going to talk about on Wednesday. Or I'll show you this again on Wednesday. So P, therefore Q, if P then Q, if Q then R, those two things entail if P then R. Is it fairly clear why they should entail that? Right, so what you get out of this is a hypothetical, but it's a hypothetical that's relevant to don't touch the electric fence. And also, I have to pay the electric bill is a totally independent. So this is P1, P2, P3, and our P1 and P2 are arguments for P3, and P3 is supposed to be an argument for the conclusion, and also P4 is a totally independent, separate reason to believe the conclusion. Yeah?
I'm just wondering, for the placement, would it matter where you put P4 on your map?
So if you put
Put it above and just go where P1 and P2, like in that same line, would it matter?
that's fine. Yeah, that's fine.
As
So
long as you have an arrow leading directly to it.
exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. It's the structure of the arrows that matter, not the length of the arrows or their direction or anything. So if you put P4 on the left or you put it on the top line, those are all totally fine. Those are easy to read as the same as this. Yeah.
What about before? Is it because when you like add the electric bill, like if you get a shock, then it's more energy and you have to pay more. That's why
That's right.
Could you also do P1 again next to P4 and have them all connect because
Interesting.
I have to pay the electric bill and don't touch the electric fence, but you kind of need the information that if you touch it, it'll shock them.
Interesting. That's really good. That's a really good suggestion. Yeah, so this would be a way to get more specific about how P4 is related to C is by also including P1 as a dependent reason here. Yeah, that's really good. That's really good. Bonus marks for that one. Yeah, I think you can read it as implied. I think the natural reading is to read it as implied. Yeah.
P1, P2, and P3, they're not like dependent, like P1, P2, and 3.
Sorry, can you repeat that question?
P1, P2, and P3, can they be dependent on each other to make P4?
So could you put them all in one line? I don't see how that could work.
Wait,
Yeah, well, kind of.
2, 3, 4 in one line, and then conclusion. Is that what?
The suggestion is, yeah, 1, 2, and 3 all in one dependent line. not to get 4, I take it the suggestion is that we do this on this one. So tell me if I've got your suggestion right. And if this is your suggestion, then it's actually kind of interesting. So P1, P2, P3, all on one line, dependently leading to the conclusion, and then P4 independently leading to it. Is that the suggestion? Good. So, like, in a way, this is true because these all need to be true for it to be related to the conclusion. But you can represent more of the structure by doing this, right? So you show how they're dependent by giving. So you give more information about the internal structure of that sub-argument by representing it as 2 lines, and you give less information by representing it all on 1 line. Yeah? Yeah.
Why not just then leave P1, P2 up, P3 plus C and P4 plus C? If you write P1, P2, P3 plus C, right, all dependently, but P3 independently plus C as well.
I see. So this is an argument against reading it this way.
Not against, I'm just saying, you can just toss out more information. You can just leave except the last premises. You can just leave everything out.
So I think that's always true for any argument. Right. So why not leave all of our premises unsupported is the question, I guess. Well, the answer is that not all premises are equally easy to believe, and sometimes you have to offer support for the premises that you need, right? So it could be the case that, somebody believes that P1 and P2, but they don't yet believe P3. And in that case, you have to support P3 somehow by offering premises for it, right? So in an actual argument, you're not going to necessarily be able to get the premises that lead directly to the conclusion, somebody to agree to those. So you have to give them some reason to believe the thing that would lead them to believe the conclusion. So this is why we have multi-layered arguments, basically. So often you have to you start a debate from places where you can agree, but those places might be fairly far away from being directly inferentially related to the conclusion. So you need to do some work to get there. And okay, we've been going at this for 50 minutes now. Okay. So for the rest of the class, I just want to talk a little bit about clarifying meaning. This was the chapter for today. Somebody asked me a really good question. Are you responsible for all of the stuff in these chapters? And the answer is no. There's stuff in these chapters of the textbook that we're not covering in class, and I will not be testing you on that on the midterm or the exam. It's helpful stuff to know. It's all very interesting and enlightening, but it will not be on the test. Yeah, question? Yes, I'll be posting all of the slides. Yeah. I did not post the slides with the breakdown of the maps ahead of time so that it would be so your minds would be fresh and you wouldn't have the answer already in front of you. Because it's really easy. It's often really easy to look at the answer and go, yeah, that looks right to me. Or it's really hard to actually produce the answer. So I want you to do the hard part here in class before you have to do it on the midterm. Yeah.
When studying for the midterm and the exam, we should focus on the slides, right?
Yes, more or less you should focus on the slides. I think that's probably a good strategy. Yeah, so there's a bunch of stuff, for example, about the uses of language in this chapter, which is not on the test. I've really had to pare down what we're covering because these summer courses just go so fast, and there's only so much that we can cover in a class. So, did I see another question back here?
Is there anything in the midterm that will require us to read the textbook?
Is there anything on the midterm that will require you to read the textbook?
I would just read the textbook and then just take the intersection of.
Yeah. I don't want to say no rashly here, because I definitely do not want to mislead you, but none of the concepts or skills that are in the textbook that have not been covered in class will be on the midterm. The textbook is helpful because it explains this stuff in different language, it explains it from a slightly different angle. It's also the material I'm drawing on to write these lectures, in part at least, so it's helpful from a variety of angles. So I strongly recommend that you read the textbook, and yet at the same time, I don't think it would be strictly speaking necessary. One could very conceivably do reasonably well on the midterm without having read the textbook. I nonetheless strongly recommend that you read the textbook. That's as weaselly an answer as I can think of. Okay. Okay. Any other questions on this stuff? The midterm's like next week, isn't it? Yeah. It's coming right up. All right. While I'm talking, I'll pass around the attendance sheet. Please, once again, sign only on the, in this case, it's the left-hand box for July 17th. And I'm strongly considering getting a different room because this is not everybody in this class, so attendance is not perfect for these lectures. It will be very nearly perfect for the midterm, which means you'll be kind of right beside each other. So I think it would be better if I could find a room that, like, the other thing about this room is that the desks are nicely stepped up so you can see right over the person's shoulder in front of you. So there's a bunch of reasons why this is a suboptimal room to write a test in. So I'm strongly considering moving the midterm to a bigger room or a flatter room at the very least. I will definitely make announcements, so please check the Blackboard. You should be checking the Blackboard regularly for announcements. I will make an announcement in class if we do get another room. So really good question. I suspect that we won't be writing in this room, if that's all right with everyone. If it's not all right with you, I know you're a cheater, so. Okay. Okay, so let's talk about clarifying meaning. So the main point in clarifying meaning that I'd like you to take away from this is what's called the principle of charity. But the principle of charity has a fairly restricted, if you actually read it strictly, it has a fairly restricted scope. So there's a couple other related principles that I'd like to talk about as well. So the basic idea of the principle of charity is to adopt the most charitable interpretation of other people's words among the possible interpretations suggested by the context. So this is straight out of the textbook. So what that means is that if you've got a sentence with more than one way of interpreting it, more than one reasonable interpretation, you should always pick the one that makes the most sense given the context. So the one that makes the other person's claim sensible and sound and reasonable. Yeah? Now, that's a fairly restricted principle, right? It just says, given a couple of reasonable interpretations, pick the one that's most reasonable. And you should do this. You should definitely do this in your approach to interpreting people's words. Some people take this to mean something like always be nice, which is not exactly what the principle of charity says, is it? Right? It doesn't say be nice to people. You should be nice to people, but that's not exactly what the principle says. So a couple of other principles are helpful as well, neither of which amount to be nice either, but they kind of get more of the rich subtlety of the kind of how to behave in an exchange of ideas sort of thing. So Davidson's principle of rational accommodation is another version of this. He says, we make maximum sense of the words and thoughts of others when we interpret in a way that optimizes agreement, right? So that is, if I think my words mean one thing and you're trying to interpret them, you should try to interpret them in a way such that we agree on what my words mean, and I'll do the same for you. Furthermore, there's a much broader principle here called Grice's principle of cooperation. It says, a conversation is a cooperative activity, so try to work together to advance the topic at hand. That's much broader than the other two, isn't it? Right? So the principle of charity just says, if there's two interpretations, choose the one that makes the most sense. Grice's thing says, try to cooperate in conversation. It's a much broader principle. All of these are worth adopting, I would suggest to you, though. All of these are meant to both help you constrain how to interpret other people's languages, but they're also meant to, the reason that these are really good guidelines is what happens in a debate, and especially what happens in a debate between people who have strong, passionate disagreements about things. And I can tell you from extensive experience that most of the time, between most people, debate will break down. You will stop communicating effectively, you will stop listening to each other, you will get so angry you can barely hear what the other person is saying. The blood will be ringing in your ears, and you will not be able to have an effective conversation. That was pretty much my life as a debater right into grad school. That's how I debated. I would use debate as a kind of attack on another person. And success was if they started crying or something. Like that was my condition for having won, was when I emotionally devastated the other person. And I can tell you that that's not a good way of changing other people's ideas. What the beliefs that you'll change about them are, if they thought this guy's all right, they'll come away thinking this guy's a jerk. And I'm gonna try not to hang around him anymore. So that's essentially what happens if you don't maintain basic civility in an exchange. And so that's the stick. The carrot is what happens when you can do that. So debate, what I discovered in grad school, so in undergrad, it was a bunch of classes full of people that I probably would never see again, and I was just trying to look like the smartest guy in the room. But grad school, in my experience, was very different from that. You had a small group of people, and it would be the same people for the next 5 years. And you really, really needed their help, because their feedback could be the difference between a sort of half-formed idea and a really good idea. So you needed these people, and you needed them to come back the next day and talk to you again. And that environment was a really good one for learning this skill of having a debate that's nonetheless respectful and kind and peaceful. And I can tell you that there's this amazing space. There's this amazing place that you can get to where it's like magic. Like magic is like conjuring objects from thin air. A conversation like this is like conjuring ideas from thin air. Two people with some non-overlapping set of ideas come together, and they both come away with new ideas that neither of them came to the conversation with. It's incredible. It's beautiful. It's an amazing thing that can happen, but it only happens within a community of trust. It only happens when everybody in the conversation trusts that everybody else is trying to cooperate, at least trying to cooperate, at least trying to see the other person's point of view, at least trying to participate in good faith. The only possible way that you get to this place is by having this kind of trust, circle of trust, circle of cooperation. It's very easy to get in small groups that need each other very badly. It's harder and harder the bigger the group is. It's harder to maintain this kind of space. But it's amazing. If you can find it, it's paradise. Because you can make each other smarter. By challenging each other's ideas, you find new things to think about, new ways of understanding. It's incredible. I strongly recommend it. But you can't get there by kicking down doors. You can only get there by getting people to trust that you mean well, that you're going to listen and respond to what they have to say. It's the only way. Don't even try it on the internet, I would recommend, because none of that's in place, right? It's anonymous. Probably you're never going to talk to that person again. They have no reason to trust you. You have no reason to trust them. I don't recommend that you apply these principles to your sworn enemies either. So debate is a fun times activity. It's a good activity for people who are well-fed, physically safe. Nobody's trying to threaten you. Nobody's trying to hurt you. You know, you've had enough sleep. Like, the conditions have to be really, really good to have a productive conversation. And if somebody's like chasing you with an axe, don't try to debate them. That's the wrong time for it, right? If somebody wishes you ill in a really deep way and you don't think that anything you say is going to change it, that's not the right time to have a debate. Don't try to start a trust circle under those conditions. So I'm not saying always do these things. I'm saying if you have the opportunity where you can build up trust with a person or a small group of people, there's this really great thing that you can have. You can participate in this amazing, people becoming more than the sum of their parts. And it's wonderful, but you gotta really cultivate it like a garden. You have to really carefully grow such a space. You cannot force it, and you sure as heck can't get it by telling people that they're dumb. So, okay. So these are the principles. And I'd like to focus in on Grice's principle of cooperation, just to kind of highlight this in a somewhat formal way, to look at what happens and to highlight the ways in which even everyday normal conversation only functions with a minimal level of cooperation from everybody involved. So if somebody's dragging their feet in a conversation, they could be saying all true things, but nonetheless the conversation will immediately break down. So the point of this exercise, we're going to go through 4 maxims that make up Grice's cooperative principle, and they're all basically just like try to play nice in conversation, try to work with the other person. But you'll see, if you stop doing any of these things, you basically can't even have a normal conversation. So the maximum quantity says, make your contribution as informative as required, but not more. The maximum quality says, do not say things that are false or for which you do not have any evidence. The maximum of relation says, say things that are relevant and only things that are relevant. And the maximum of manner says, say things in a brief, orderly, clear way. So we'll go through each of these in just quick examples. So, maximum of quantity. A says, how's Terry doing in his work? And B says, well, he shows up on time. Okay, so suppose a conversational context in which Terry's actually doing really well in his work. Terry's exceeding goals, and he's doing all the things, and he's really an excellent employee in general. And B says, well, shows up on time. So you've got a bunch of, B's got a bunch, suppose, and B knows all of this stuff. B has not offered the amount of information that was expected of them, have they? B has offered substantially less information when more information would have been relevant. And they've said something, well, if that's all you have to say about somebody, that implies that everything else is going badly, right? So the assumption in in this exchange is that B is going to offer up as much information as is relevant in the context. And if B decides to do that, it's not that B said anything false here. So suppose Terry shows up on time. It's not that B told a lie or said something untrue. What they've done is just violated the maximum of quantity. They've violated the assumption that you're going to say all the stuff that's relevant to say in that context. Yeah? So again, it's not the case that you have to say something false in order to violate this maxim. It's just that you have to not be cooperating. There's another one. So where's the washroom? The washroom is located in the northern hemisphere in the country of Canada, and more specifically in Ontario. It's the city of Mississauga in a building operated by the UTM. It can be found on the 2nd floor of that building, blah, 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 blah. So this is a case where you're offering way more information that was relevant, right? You're supposed to offer the right amount, not too much and not too little. And once again, B is not saying false things. It's not that B is incorrect about any of B's statements. They've just decided to give the incorrect amount of information, or an amount of information that is not cooperative in the context. Okay, so you can easily imagine a conversation going completely off the rails where A and B are all saying true things, but they're not cooperating. Okay, maximum of quality. I think that's pretty straightforward. Just don't lie. Don't say things that are false, right? Don't say false things. That's not cooperative. And don't say things that you don't have any evidence for either. So even if you don't know it's false, don't say it if you have no reason to believe it. That should be fairly straightforward. So the maxim of relation. So you always try to say things that are relevant. This is an example from Grice's original paper, which I'll put on the blackboard if you're curious. Suppose A says, I'm out of petrol, gasoline. B says, there's a garage around the corner. Now imagine that the garage has been closed for 10 years, it hasn't had a drop of gas in 10 years, and B knows this. B knows perfectly well that there's no gas to be had at that petrol station around the corner. B has not said something false, right? They've just said something that's irrelevant to the interests being advanced. So A wants to know, hey, where do I get some petrol? So the implication of saying I'm out of gas is I need some, where can I find some? And B has said a true thing, but they've said an irrelevant thing because with this investigative context in mind, a garage with no gasoline is irrelevant. I once heard it suggested that all of these can be reduced to just say things that are relevant, the relevant things, the relevant amount of things, the relevant manner of things, and so on. So there's that. And maximum of manner. So this is just say things, don't be overly verbose and stuff. So I hear you went to the opera last night. How was the lead singer? It says the singer produced a series of sounds corresponding closely to the score of an aria from Rigoletto. And that's just like an excessively wordy way of phrasing your answer. Again, this is a way of not cooperating. So the best way to communicate pretty much anything is the simplest way that is also as accurate as you need it to be. So once you satisfied all the other maxims, the simplest way of saying it is the best way. And you can be super annoying and non-cooperative by saying relevant things, by saying true things, but by just being excessively verbose. Yeah, question?
Can't a lie lead to better cooperation? When it's really bad and you say, oh, you're really good.
Yes, that's true. So if what you're trying to do is preserve peace in your community, sometimes a small lie can do that. So the strategy here is to, well, okay. Partly you don't want to ever do that because lying gives people incorrect information. Yeah, but maybe more seriously, like that is a concern, but maybe it's not your top concern. So often these maxims conflict with each other. You can't satisfy them all completely. And then it's a question of which of them do you sacrifice for which. So often you'll have to consider trade-offs between these maxims. So it might be the case that telling all of the truth is more information than they could use. And so you should dial it back a little. Yeah, so the maxim of quality, I think you're saying, is sometimes the maxim of quality is a harsh mistress, and you might not want to follow it completely. Yeah, so this is the issue of try to be nice when you can be nice, but maybe being nice isn't always the most overriding concern. Sometimes telling the truth to somebody, even though it's unpleasant, is a more important issue than being kind or it's hard for me to imagine a case where you're being fully uncooperative. So it's a question of how do I want to cooperate in this situation? Do I want to preserve the set of social niceties, or do I want to help this person by giving them a larger slice of the truth than they had before? And I don't want to say that one of those is always the right strategy. I try to minimize lying in my life. I find it stresses me out. It makes me unhappy as a person. Whenever I have to lie in a context, it makes me deeply stressed out. So I become as my life goes on, I've been winnowing down the amount of lying that I have to do and putting myself in situations where I don't have to lie, and I'm much happier now. So I recommend that if at all possible. Yeah.
So can we just kind of implicitly append a fifth element to say the maximum best intention, that you just try to preserve as many of those as you can?
I think that's so. I think the overall principle says basically that. So the cooperative principle, that's the sort of overarching principle of this, and these four maxims are parts of the cooperative principle. Yeah. Yeah.
In a sentence, how would you summarize the maximum of relation?
The maximum of relation is say things that are relevant. That would be my way. So if I was naming these, I would have called it the maximum of relevance. Okay. So these are Grice's four conversational maxims. And when maxims conflict, this is again Grice's example, you just gotta pick what's the most appropriate place to make the compromise. So suppose B knows that A is planning a short trip to France, and A asks, where does C live? B says, somewhere in the south of France. Well, if A is trying to get there, that's clearly not enough information to satisfy them. So they've, in some sense, violated the maximum of quantity. They have not provided enough information. But suppose they don't actually know where they live. Then, instead of giving a false answer or giving an answer that they don't have any information to support, they choose not to violate the maximum of quality. So they didn't give enough quantity, but that's because they didn't want to give low quality information. So instead of just making up, they're in Marseille or whatever, you say this, right? So there's going to be lots of situations where you can't satisfy all of these things completely, and in those cases, the cooperative thing to do is to make some compromise somewhere. Yeah.
So what if you say, like, I'm not sure specifically where, but somewhere in the south of France? Is that
That's great.
satisfy all the maxims?
I think it would.
Still violating a maxim?
I think that would satisfy. So yeah, I'm not quite sure, but somewhere in the south of France. I don't have any more information for you. I apologize. That seems like a pretty good way of doing it. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I don't want to give the impression that it's always easy or straightforward to always satisfy all of them. But yeah, you do your best to satisfy them as best as possible. Right. Okay. So. Combining these, charity involves offering an interpretation that assumes that the other person is both rational and being cooperative. So the principle of charity works. It works because usually people are being rational and trying to be cooperative. It's amazing actually when you go through your day counting when people are being cooperative and when they're not. We're almost always being cooperative. And conversation is such that conversation is so vague and so ambiguous that if we weren't pretty much always at least trying to be cooperative, it just wouldn't work. So the principle of charity is a good rational principle. It says choose the one that makes the most sense given a context, and that usually works. It usually gives you the interpretation that they meant because most people are trying to be rational and they're trying to be cooperative most of the time. Sometimes you cannot find an interpretation that preserves both the rationality and cooperativeness assumptions. Tragically, we're not all rational and cooperative maximally all the time. So in those cases, the charitable interpretation is one that seems to you to involve the least violation of the combination of rationality and cooperativeness. And typically that's a judgment call made in a specific context. I know many of you hate this stuff about like, oh, it's all just fuzzy and you just got to figure it out for yourself. It's not a very helpful thing for me to say to you, really. Like, figure it out for yourself. Like, well, you didn't have to pay tuition to know that, but nonetheless, I hope that it's helpful to have these things at least named. That's my hope in this lecture, is to have names for these things that you can put on them, because it's often the case that somebody's not violating logical principles, they're not saying something false, and they're not violating logical principles. What they're doing is violating the implicit norms of conversation. Right? So when they're dragging their feet in conversation, it can be that they're being perfectly logical and they're saying things that are perfectly true, and they'll say, well, I'm being logical and true, so you have nothing to say to me. Like, well, no, actually, you need to also try to be cooperative in your exchanges. So those are the names for those things. Right. So to get more specific about vagueness and ambiguity, this is a distinction from the textbook that I'd like you to know. So vagueness is when a statement has no clear interpretation. You cannot tell exactly what the statement means. That's different than ambiguity. Ambiguity is when there's more than one reasonably clear interpretation. I hope it came across from the stuff on definitions that we did last time that vagueness stalks our language. It's everywhere. It's sort of sprinkled throughout. So if you're really looking for vagueness, if you need concepts to be super crisp, you're in trouble. Or you should be in either computer science, math, or logic, because those are the places where you find really good definitions. Everywhere else, there's at least a little vagueness. But usually we only call something vague when it's sort of noticeably vague or substantially vague. So everything is vague to a degree. When you call something vague, what you mean is that this is more vague than usual, or notably vague, something like that. Ambiguity is not always the case that a statement is ambiguous. Sometimes there is just one reasonable interpretation. It'll be a little bit vague, but there's only one of them. So that's the difference. Yeah?
So everything that's ambiguous is vague, not everything that's vague is ambiguous?
On what I just said, everything but formal systems is vague. So everything that is ambiguous is also vague, except formal systems. But not everything that is ambiguous, not everything that is vague is ambiguous. That's right. Okay, good. All right, did I do examples? Yeah, so examples. So In any context, like I was saying, except math, logic, and computer programs, very likely to be some vagueness, but we should distinguish degrees of vagueness. So you want to have the least amount of vagueness in your language as you can get usually, but sometimes it doesn't actually matter. So here are some degrees of vagueness. So that building is tall is pretty vague. That building is tall for a residential unit, it's a little less vague. That building is the tallest residential unit in the city. Now we're getting less and less vague. That building is exactly 50 stories tall. Now it's not really that vague. There's some vagueness in how tall a story is, but that's the most vagueness that I can see in that sentence, right? So these are degrees of vagueness. Depending on our specific goals in a conversation, vagueness might be fine or it might be a big problem. So can you jump over that building? No, that building is tall. That's a vague, we just said that was the vaguest sentence in our list, and yet it's perfectly clear enough to get the point across, right? So if the question is, can you jump over that building? You know, it being a tall building is perfectly clear enough. You don't need to be like, well, exactly how many stories is it, you vague person, right? That's not a important question to ask. However, how are you going to mark the quiz? With great care. Is too vague. Given the kind of question being asked, you know, they want concrete, this A wants concrete, specific information about the rubric, and if you just give them this flippant answer, that's, in that context, too vague. Yeah?
So is there some standard that you're going by, I guess, like judging these responses? Because you seem to be judging them in how well they answered the intended question.
Yeah, yeah. So this is how context determines how vague it's okay to be. So if given, so that's why I'm giving questions here rather than just a statement, because the question sets the context. And you can, even without, so it would be much easier if you knew A and B as people, you knew what was going on in their lives, you had a bunch of information in them, that all that would add extra information for how much vagary is okay. Just the question, you know, you can kind of you get a scenario roughly from that. So that's me adding context to these. So you use the context to decide how much vagueness is okay in a situation. So yeah, that's the standard is set by the context, basically.
But then how do you judge? What is the measure? There's no ruler for this, right? So what is
Yeah, there is not a universal standard.
tape measure
Yeah, there's no vagueness tape measure. I wish there was, but there isn't. I'm sorry. There's more or less vague statements, and there are statements that are too vague for a context, and statements that are not too vague for a context, and that's really the best we can do.
So that's vague.
It is vague. It is vague, but in this context, it's okay. So yeah. Yeah. This is informal reasoning. This is just putting, at this point, we're just putting names to things that you already do. So if you had no idea how to do this, me telling you this stuff would be completely useless. But the fact is that you do this all the time. So you often give or receive somewhat vague answers and navigate the problems perfectly fine, perfectly transparent without thinking about it at all. So you're all able to do this already. And if you're cooperating, then you're not going to ask people to clarify things that you don't need clarification about. So can you jump over that building? No, it's too tall. Well, how tall is it? That's not a question that you should ask because you didn't need the information. How are you going to mark the quiz? With great care. Come on, be reasonable. I actually need an answer to this. Please give me more information. Right? So vagueness is you're being sufficiently non-vague when they don't have to ask follow-up questions. That's more or less the answer. So if you give somebody enough information to pursue their goals, then you've been clear enough. Okay, good. It's not a completely non-vague answer, but it's an answer. Good. All right, so ambiguity. A statement is ambiguous if it admits of more than one reasonable interpretation. So the principle of charity is just about ambiguity, and what it says is choose the interpretation that makes the most sense wherever possible. So for example, I didn't brush my teeth again today. This is something my wife said to me. I'm like, you mean how many days since you brushed your teeth? She says, no. I brushed them this morning. I didn't brush them again today. Right? I didn't again brush my teeth today. I didn't brush them twice today. Here's Groucho Marx. Last night I shot an elephant in my pajamas. How he got into my pajamas, I'll never know. So, of course, it's an ambiguous sentence. Last night I shot an elephant in my pajamas is an ambiguous sentence. It could either mean I was in my pajamas and I shot the elephant, or it could mean that the elephant was in my pajamas and then I shot it. In case you were deriving any joy at all from that joke, let's break it down into its parts and suck the life out of it. Yeah. All right, so but is it, okay, this should be fairly clear. There's two ways of reading both of those, the first sentence and the first sentence of the second thing, and they're ambiguous. But once you know what you mean, like I didn't brush my teeth again today, means there was no second time in the day where I brushed my teeth. I think that's fairly clear. It's not that vague, right? Assuming that you have one unit of brushing your teeth. Like I guess it could be vague in the sense that like one touch of the toothbrush counts as brushing your teeth. Usually, I think what you mean is, gave them a good scrub. So in that sense, it's not vague in the sense that it has two clear meanings if you know which one is intended. Right? So either meaning would be clear, you just need to know which one is intended. Similarly, last night I shot an elephant in my pajamas. To be in pajamas is not a really vague concept. You're either wearing pajamas or you're not wearing pajamas. And so if you know what's intended, they're not vague, but they are ambiguous. Yeah? Okay, vagueness and ambiguity. Right, so this is my favorite pet peeve. I love getting angry about this when people do this in conversation. So here's an ambiguity between three different readings of the sentence birds fly. Birds fly is a short, complete sentence, and it could mean any one of these three things in the context. It could mean all birds fly. It could mean generally speaking, birds fly, or it could mean there exists some birds which fly. Right, okay? And English does not tell you, just from the sentence birds fly, English has no explicit markers about which is intended. So it's ambiguous between these three. Right? And you may recognize this debate from social media. So if somebody says, men are scum, and they say, but I'm not scum. I say, well, I didn't mean all men, did I? Right? This is a conversation that happens all over and over again. So you say a general thing, and then somebody says, yeah, but not all. I say, well, yeah, I didn't say all. But then if the person's really tricky, they'll go like this. So right. So here are three arguments that you could make based on these three different readings. So all birds fly, penguins are birds, therefore penguins fly. That is a valid argument. Perfectly valid argument. So if you mean what's called the universal reading of birds fly, then you can infer from that if penguins are birds, then penguins fly. But now try this one. Generally birds fly, penguins are birds, therefore penguins fly. That is not a valid argument, right? Just from the fact that generally a category has some property, you can't infer that some member of that category definitely has that property. You might be able to infer, for example, generally birds fly, penguins are birds, therefore probably penguins fly, or like plausibly penguins fly, or something like that. Like, given no other information, their category membership makes you suspect that they might fly. But this is not a valid argument. And of course, this one is definitely not. So there exist flying birds, penguins are birds, therefore penguins fly. That's clearly not a valid inference, right? So if you say men are pigs, and then you point to a specific man and say, therefore that guy's a pig, the validity of that inference depends crucially on what meaning you associate with. So whether you're using it as a universal, as what's called a generic, or whether you're using it as an existential. Yeah, so those things. And the surface level English does not distinguish. Just the sentence birds fly does not tell you by itself which of those three claims are being made. And so you have to clarify. And notice that some of these are much easier to defend than others. So if you want to defend the generic claim that generally birds fly, you can look at like a statistical study that shows you like, yeah, 90% of birds were shown to fly under experimental conditions or whatever. That's an easy one to defend. The universal claim is much harder to defend. Right? All birds fly. You need some complete enumeration of all of the birds and evidence that all of them fly. The existential claim is the easiest to defend. There exist birds which fly. You really just need to see one bird flying. And then you can say that the existential is true. And so there exists at least one flying bird. So.
But when you said that, like you said, there exist birds which fly, does that kind of implicitly mean at least two?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I suppose the plural does, yeah, so.
Yeah, like there exist birds. If they just said that there's only one, I kind of haven't shown that there exist birds.
Right, right. Okay, then you need two birds that fly. Yeah.
No, I mean three.
Yeah. So if the original claim was, so the original sentence was birds fly. There's a plural on there, so I think, yeah. So in this case, in strict logic, you talk about existentials as like there exists at least one. But in this case, because the generic has a plural on the s on the end of it, I think you would have to say there exist birds which fly. Yeah. And be wary in debate because sometimes people will defend one of these and then make inferences based on another. So you'll say, men do thus and so on average, and that establishes maybe the generic, doesn't establish the universal, but then they'll use it as a universal to say any member of this class therefore has that property. Right? So there's a kind of bait and switch that often happens in heated, informal debates. Yeah?
When you're studying science, there's this concept of statistic validity.
Statistics,
So,
yeah.
If it's under a certain number, then it can be applied as the rule,
Right.
so to speak, where you saying all wouldn't be incorrect. So is that then a fundamental flaw in the way that science is conducted?
Right. So I'm not sure that your characterization of statistical validity is accurate. So if you show that 95% of birds fly, I don't think scientists are therefore entitled to infer the universal, and I don't think they would either.
No, I mean when inferring causal relationship.
Right.
So when instead of saying whether something correlates or whether it's causation,
Right.
they'll say if it's under 0.05%,
Yeah. The p-value is
the p-value
is lower than that. Yeah.
then it is statistically, it's a causal relationship, but then is it really causal because, like you're saying, there's that variance.
Okay, so I propose this just for today. We'll set aside inference, so statistical inferences. There's a statistical syllogism which goes like 95% of x's are y's. This is an x, therefore there's a 95% chance that it's a y. P-values don't really give you that. So p-value, and they also don't really give you necessarily a causal relationship. So p-value is the expected, what's the probability that this result is just a fluke? And so you can get a low p-value. So a low p-value means it's very unlikely to be just a fluke. You can get a low p-value for things that are just correlations, not causally related. So that's a slightly different concept. But let's set that aside. We'll talk about inductive generalizations later on in the course, if that's okay. Yeah. But it is related to this stuff at least. Right. So very related. We've got categorical claims. So all members of category X have the property Y. So all men are mortal, all birds fly, all mammals are warm-blooded. These are categorical claims. We saw these kind of earlier as things that are typical to show up in dependent relations, right? So all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. So this is a nice categorical claim, can be used as a set of dependent relations. And there's a kind of translatability between categorical claims and conditional claims. sort of. So assuming, but only assuming the fully universal reading of a categorical claim. So you can translate the categorical into a conditional. So all birds fly is basically equivalent to the sentence, if an object is a bird, then that object flies. Right? So you can see how you can translate one type into the other. Yeah? But not the generic, right? So generally birds fly. If an object is a bird, then it flies, doesn't work. Generally birds fly, penguins are birds, therefore birds fly, or penguins fly. That doesn't work, right? So, but in the fully universal case, then it does. And of course, these are the kinds of things that enter into categorical or into dependent relations. If it's snowing, then the roads will be slippery. It is snowing, therefore the roads are slippery. Right? All dogs are mammals. Mammals are warm-blooded, therefore all dogs are warm-blooded. These are dependent relations. Okay, let's call it a day. If you want to talk about any of this, I'll be hanging around for a little while, so hang out, but that's enough for today.